All right, good morning, class. This is Professor Pronte, and I'm attempting right now to record my screen so that you guys can get a better sense of how to do this assignment that we're going to find here in Module 1 on working with economic data. All right, so I hope everyone can hear me okay. Here goes. The first thing you're going to want to do for this assignment is to open up this quiz just like so. And upon doing so, you should find a link here. Right? This link is going to take you to a site that's put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. The Federal Reserve Bank puts out lots of good economic data, and I want you guys to use this particular site for this assignment here. You'll find other estimates of things like GDP and unemployment and things like that. But this is the one that you should be using here so that we're all on the same page. All right, so let's open this up and take a look at what we find. All right, so we're arriving now, like I said, at the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. And we're going to use this search bar right here to find the data that you're going to need to answer the questions in this assignment. All right, and so I'm going to ask questions here in this quiz that are based on those measures that you learned about earlier in this module. And those are GDP, per capita GDP, unemployment, and inflation. We've got some of them listed right there. So to find the numbers that you need, let's type in gross domestic product and see what happens. All right, so there are many estimates here for GDP for the US. The difference is in terms of corrections that analysts have made about inflation and things like that. Let's go with this one right here. Billions of chained $2012, quarterly, seasonally adjusted. That's the one I want you guys to reference when answering questions about GDP. So let's open that up. And what we see here is this graph. I think this is a pretty cool graph showing us GDP for the United States going back to, looks like 1947. All right, so a couple things to note here. First up, if you look to most recent estimates of GDP, it's at 18 trillion and change. So we can see that right there. What else? The pattern that we're seeing throughout our most recent history is, of course, that GDP is growing. It's higher now than it has ever been in the United States. That's something you ought to know. We can see that here because the line is sloping up as we move through time. Right? We're measuring GDP vertically on this axis. Take note here of these gray bars that you see, class. The gray bars, notice those take place whenever you see that GDP is declining over some period of time, right there, and right there, and right there. That looks like a bad one, huh? These are recessions, right? Consecutive quarters of sustained decreases in GDP. That's kind of a cool thing to note. What else? Let me show you also how to zoom in on particular years. That's going to be useful when you're answering questions about GDP in this year or that year or whatever. If you grab these little sliders here, you can compress the time over which we're evaluating GDP. Excuse me. And by doing so, the graph is in some cases a little bit easier to read. So check that out. You can just grab these little sliders right here and adjust that accordingly. Hover over the line if you're trying to figure out what the GDP was for some particular year and quarter, which you'll be asked about on this assignment. All right, let's move ahead to another one. Let's look now at GDP per capita. I'll just type that in. Oops, capita. I like that better. And once again, there's lots of different ways that this can be estimated, but let's go with the top one right here. Real gross domestic product per capita. This is going to be showing us chained $2012, okay? And you're going to get a graph that looks really quite similar. The difference now is that we're taking that $18 trillion of GDP and change that we have produced overall, and dividing it by the over 300 million people living in the United States. So this is per person GDP. The same mechanics work for this graph as what I mentioned earlier. All right, so that's how this one looks. Let's look now at unemployment. Type that into the search bar. It'll autofill for the unemployment rate. That's good too, sure. And once again, guys, use the top one here. Our civilian unemployment rate. Let's go for seasonally adjusted. So make sure you're clicking on this one rather than the not seasonally adjusted one. Click on this guy. Open that up. And what do we see? All sorts of variation here, huh? Right, the unemployment rate today, most recent data, looks like we're about 3.9%. One of the useful things about looking at a graph like this is it gives us some better context, right? So 3.9%, is that low, is that high? You can sort of tell just by looking at what we've seen over the last 75, 80 years or so, right? It's pretty low. It's rare that unemployment has reached such low levels. Notice here we've been on this trend for quite a long time, and the pattern is sort of repeating itself, isn't it? Where unemployment is falling and falling and falling, and then we enter into a recession with those gray bars once again, and we see that the unemployment rate starts to rise. It's kind of an interesting thing, isn't it? It's kind of cool to look at these peaks here, see how high unemployment was in 1982 or in 2010 or whatever. Yeah. So that's unemployment. Let me also show you here inflation. It's going to autofill for me. Let's see here. For this one, I want you guys to click on this data series right here, the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers, to include all items. And let's see what that looks like. So the line is once again sloping up, similar pattern as we saw with GDP. This Consumer Price Index, don't forget guys, this is a way that we measure the average cost of goods and services. When the Consumer Price Index, that CPI, is higher, it means that stuff costs more. When it's lower, it means that stuff is cheaper on average. And so the pattern then that we're seeing here was pretty stable prices, growing, right? Rising prices here for a lot of American history. And then starting in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we're seeing stuff start to get much, much more expensive. All right. Let's see here. If you see a price index at, say, 200, right? Let me see if I can find 200 right there, around 200 in 2005, 2006. The interpretation would then be that goods and services cost exactly twice as much as they did back when the price index was at 100. There we go. So that's the usefulness of a price index. You can compare changes over time. All right. On this data series, I also want to show you guys how to edit the graph. So let's open up this orange button right here, click that, and see what happens. Instead of just looking at our price index, let's check out the percent change from a year ago by clicking that. And then I'll X this out so we can see what the data series looks like. So what's presented on the screen now is the change in this CPI, right, from one year to the next. In other words, that's showing us inflation. Right? So if the price index goes up by 3% from one year to the next, you would say that there's been 3% inflation, and stuff is now costing 3% more than it did earlier. Looking here at the data series, anytime this change in the CPI is close to this black line down there at 0, it means that prices are stable. Anytime you're up here, up above, it means that you've got fairly significant inflation. So notice in U.S. economic history, we've had a couple of bouts of real high inflation. That's no fun, is it? In recent years, we're seeing that inflation is relatively mild, 1%, 2%. Nothing to become too alarmed about. So there you go. All right, guys, there you have it. A quick little overview of how to work with some of this economic data. Again, these are the numbers, these ones that I've showed you here in this video. These are the ones that you should be referencing to answer the questions contained within this quiz. Adios.